So today we are going to talk about the 19th century already. So after spending most of the semester talking about earlier stuff, we finally reached at least the 19th century. Which is still way behind the seminar, I'm sure. And you are probably already doing modernism in there, and we are not yet there. And basically in these two lessons that we are going to have, so this one and the next one, when we look at the 19th century, we are going to look at the 19th century in two different perspectives. Today, we are actually not even going to focus on the whole 19th century, but most of it, because we are going to focus on the Victorian period, and Victoria being, or having been rather, the longest reigning monarch in British history until, of course, Elizabeth II, our present British monarch, took over several years ago. So that's a long period, of course. But we are not even necessarily going to talk about life in the Victorian period, but more the cultural movements that set the scene for art and literature and painting. And next time we are going to talk about life in the 19th century, both before and during the Victorian period. I have chosen some movements to talk about which are influential and important, but I'm not presenting them in their order of importance. So it's not that we are getting anywhere. We just look at them one after the other and try to get some kind of overview. And the first one we are going to talk about is the Oxford movement, or they are also called the Tractarians. Now, the Oxford movement is more or less their more official name, whereas Tractarians is rather like their nickname and not necessarily a very pleasant nickname. So whereas, if you remember, we recalled that the Gothic was a way to make fun of the movement, the Baroque was used as a kind of nasty nickname, and so on. So it often happens that the nickname is used to tease a movement or a period, but then, in hundreds and hundreds of years of time, that name loses its negative, biting, critical edge. Well, this is not the case here. The Tractarians, the name Tractarians was used to tease them, and it still doesn't sound very good. A tract is still not a word with a very positive meaning. So, in fact, this one is still, if you didn't want to have some kind of relatively negative connotation, it's still better if you actually call them the Oxford movement. Now, not surprisingly, the Oxford movement had something to do with Oxford University. Mainly, the members, mostly, not always, there were a few exceptions, were either students or teachers at Oxford University, or former students of that place. In fact, some of those who were not Oxford graduates or Oxford teachers were from Cambridge, so although there is a big rivalry, of course, between those two universities, in this case it was actually something relatively shared. But it had much, much, much more to do with Oxford than with Cambridge. And this is basically a movement that dealt intimately with religion. So, at first sight, it might not have an extremely wide relevance for culture in general, but that would be actually a mistake, because in fact it did have an influence way beyond the actual issue of religion itself. But it all had to do with religion in its core. And of course, the members were all originally of Anglican faith, which doesn't surprise us, because they were students or teachers of Oxford, and we have actually mentioned this quite a few times that for a long time in British history, you had to be a member of the Church of England to be allowed to study at university. And while this eventually got repealed, it still was still a living thing at this period. So, of course, they were of Anglican faith, but while they were members of the Church of England, what is important about this movement is that they were not happy members of the church. They were not satisfied with what was going on, and they wanted to change it. Specifically, their main point was that the Church of England got too far away from true Christianity. This is, by the way, wonderful, because every Christian movement always declares themselves the true Christians, and they all say that we have to return to the original ways of Christianity. These are not an exception. So they also came up with this well-known motto that the church is too far, we have to get back to the true roots. But in their case, it is a bit different than in most cases, because yes, reform movements, like, for example, Lutheranism, Calvinism, also said the same, that the church, there was no Catholic church at that point, but the church got too far from the teachings of the Bible. There is too much infrastructure, too much ritual, too much money, too many big buildings, and so on and so forth, and we have to get back to what is in the Bible. Now, these guys actually are, funnily enough, doing sort of the opposite. What their problem with the Church of England is that it has actually become, or had become, because we are in the past, it had become by that point too much of a Protestant church. Too much focused on the Bible, not focused enough on ritual and tradition, those kind of things. We will talk about this. So, in fact, they had a theory which they called the branch theory, saying that true Christianity, the original Christianity, is present as if in a tree that has three main branches. And everybody else is just like off. They left behind the true Christianity. And those three are basically one tree. In a way, one church. Like traditionally, those three are considered three separate churches, but for the Oxford movement, they are just one church with three main branches. And those three are the Catholic Church, Orthodox Christianity, so the church in Byzantium. And, of course, the third one is the Church of England. So, basically, these three branches are the only true Christian churches, and Luther and Calvin and all of those, and the Presbyterians, these are all, mistaken. But, yes, it's a tree, but imagine the tree. The tree has branches, and then there are things growing on the tree branches, for example, apples or pears, or doesn't matter. Now, if those things are too heavy, then the branch is pulled down. And basically, if it is pulled too far down, it can break. And then it can get separated from the tree. So the point is, yes, we are still part of the tree. But there are so many rotten fruits on that tree, so many teachings that are just not true to the ideal of Christianity. So we have to get rid of those things, and we have to get back and move the branches closer to each other. So we are too far off. And basically, they had a series of publications called Tracts for the Times. So they haven't yet thought of tracts in this negative sense, but when they got called tractarians, it was already something else. in which they were discussing theological questions, questions of faith, but in a way that it was not addressed just to the church. So imagine these as short little pamphlets or leaflets, which was only partially addressed to theologians and students of theology, but also to the general public, to members of the church, simply. And they were primarily against, they had a whole range, and all of them was devoted to one specific issue. So obviously when I mention these two things, that's oversimplification, but anyway. They were against theological liberalism, so back to the good old dogma and orthodoxy and not all the away with those liberal things, and against secularization as well. So no, we need more ritual, we need more symbols, we need more songs, we need more music, we need more pomp, not this kind of let's go into church and discuss the Bible kind of, and no. Everything nicely. In fact, while they were originally members of the Church of England, several key members of the movement went so far to actually convert to Catholicism, because saying we can try to reform the Church of England, but the real thing is still Catholicism. There is nothing as real and original as the Catholic Church. So, even though it's still, they are not prosecuted to the same extent as before, but still it's not really winning the lottery even in the Victorian period to be a Catholic. They said, no, for me, it's a question of principle. I'm going to return to the good old faith. However, what is interesting is that they were able to make very, very serious and important changes to the Church of England. So they were basically successful in most things that they wanted. And some of them still said, that is still not enough. I rather become a Catholic. So they got actually successful in some things, like that they did bring back very much set liturgy and set ceremony, like the way you would expect in a Catholic church. So this is the reason, if you go now to a Mass celebrated by the Church of England and the Catholic Mass here, you wouldn't find that much differences because of these guys. Before that, it wasn't the case. Also, religious orders are back. Henry VIII basically did two things: declared himself the head of the church instead of the Pope, and got rid of the religious orders. And these guys convinced that church that religious orders are cool and we absolutely need them. Which is interesting, to be honest, because, of course, Henry VIII got rid of them, not because he had any personal problems with religious orders, but because he wanted their buildings, their gold objects that they had, their land, etc. So now let's bring them back and let's give them buildings again. It's interesting, but why not? Saints are back. Whereas normally Protestants don't believe in saints, and in fact often most typically consider the veneration of saints, talking to dead people, praying to dead people, they tend to consider this as idolatry, one of the worst possible sins. It's back in the Church of England. So in the Church of England, just like in Catholicism, they have days of the saints. It is okay to pray to saints, all that. So, interesting. Now, so one important reason for the Oxford movement, the reason we have to mention it, is because it actually had a counter effect on the Church of England. So whereas relatively immediate reaction to the secession of Henry VIII was getting rather Protestant in both practice and theory. It is bringing it as much back to Catholicism as it is possible without actually freaking people out too much. However, we should, if we really wanted to be precise and detailed, which we don't try to be here, we would have to talk about actually High Church and Low Church in the Church of England with their different rules and ways and all that. Let's not do that here. That would lead us too far away. Instead, let's talk about some of the members. And one of them I want to talk about is John Henry Newman, who actually wrote the book Apologia Pro Vita Sua, an apology for his life. Now this is actually misleading in that the title is in Latin, but not the book. So, whereas usually up to this point, if we read the Latin title, it meant the text was in Latin too, not here. This is an actually English autobiography with a fancy Latin title. That's sort of, but it makes sense. It's not just there to be fancy. It is there because the guy is a member of a movement that wants to return to Catholicism. And whereas the Church of England was already in English, everything in church at this point, not in the Catholic Church. In the Catholic Church, until actually the 20th century, and not the beginning of that, the Mass was in Latin. And the priest would stand with their back to the people, you know, ranting away in Latin to himself, basically. So compared to that, this is not the case in the Church of England, but the fact that he raised the title in Latin might have something to do with him not trying to show off, but rather trying to show his appreciation and affiliation with the traditions of the Christian Church in Latin, about which actually the Byzantines, the Eastern Christians, would immediately protest, because they, of course, do things in Greek. But that's again neither here nor there. So anyway, the reason why this is interesting is because while he obviously, with this title, it must be obvious, he actually approaches his life as the life of a sinner who is basically ashamed for the fact that he's a sinner, partially, and this is fun because the word apology in English has two meanings, if you think about it. One is saying sorry for something and being sorry for being the way you are. The other is a synonym for defense, defending your position, defending your life. So, and he's obviously using both of these meanings here. So he's both, in a way, defending the ways of his life and to some extent also apologizing for them. So anyway, this was a biography, an autobiography, in which, obviously, if he's approaching this from the perspective of sin, it must be full of juicy details, right? Of course it is. So besides being, you know, a religiously based autobiography, it also was the period's absolutely most widely read autobiography because it was fun to read. And then another important member is the author of another very successful book in the period, The Christian Year. This again is a book which is basically a calendar. You know, it goes through the whole year, and for every day of the year you would have a few pages of reading. Christian year, so obviously this one is a religious calendar, so it is based on days of which are important for the Christian faith, so various feasts and but in any case, a book which is quite useful for the average churchgoer and not just churchgoer. Okay, now where the Oxford movement really strongly touches culture is in the figure of Gerard Manley Hopkins, whom we primarily remember these days as a poet and not as a member of the Oxford movement, although if you actually don't just have heard about him, but actually read something, then it becomes quite obvious that these two are very much related. So he was a poet, one of the best poets of the Victorian period, and also, as the picture very well shows, a cleric, at first Anglican, and then a Jesuit. Any idea what it means? It's a religious order, but not an Anglican religious order, a Catholic religious order. So meaning, he not only just converts to Catholicism, but he joins a religious order, a Catholic religious order. So his way from the Church of England to being as Catholic as possible is quite complete. Okay, now, in terms of his poetry, it's great, and he introduces a more natural rhythm and rhyme pattern than what we are used to in the Romantic poetry, or especially in Augustan poetry. And also, he lived a lot in Wales, so traditional Welsh poetic patterns had a strong influence on his poetry, which is interesting because Welsh poetry is rhyming poetry. So unlike, let's say, blank verse, and not just rhyming, but in fact in Welsh poetry you usually don't just have rhymes at the end of the line, but even inside the line. So in fact rhymes can be even more rhyming than what you would normally expect, which is not necessarily typically the case in his poetry, but still. Also, Welsh traditional poetry is very rhythmical, but rhythmical in a different way than what you would have in all those forms that we've mentioned, which are typical in English. So it's not at all iambic pentameter which we are talking about. So this is cool because this is fresh, this is something different. Somebody who writes poetry in a way that we don't find iambic pentameters yet again, but maybe something else. I'm not saying he never does that, but he's obviously not typically doing that. Yeah, strongly musical, and in some ways he is a precursor of modernist poetry, not necessarily in the form, but more in the content in this case. Okay, the next person is not daily discussed. So while Hopkins is somebody whom you often hear about, unless you are very interested in Gothic Revival or you're an architecture student, you might not necessarily hear about this guy by name. This, however, doesn't change anything in the fact that he was the leader of the movement we know as Gothic Revival. And this is another point, and in fact probably the most important point, where the Oxford movement reaches way beyond issues of what happens inside the church and what language they use and what kind of rituals they use or they don't use. This is because the 19th century, because of the Oxford movement leading to the Gothic Revival movement, makes an immediately visible effect on how the cities look. Because if you go to London, for example, and you visit the tourist sites, and if it's not the Tower of London, which, as we remember, is of course partially Anglo-Saxon, partially Romanesque, etc., but anything more recent, it's a high chance that what you will see is going to be Gothic Revival. Because most of the big fancy buildings that you see in London are from the 19th century, and this ends up being the style of 19th century British architecture, Gothic Revival. So everything they build in the period almost is fake Gothic. Gothic Revival, you know. But I mean, like, looks like Gothic, but was not built in the Middle Ages, is what I mean. And this has a lot to do with the fact that Pugin, who is the leader of this movement, was a member of the Oxford movement. Because they, in the 19th century, yet again, come up with the question, what should truly English architecture be like? What is our own tradition? And whereas in the Renaissance, of course, they said, oh, it has to be based on Greek and Roman style, because in the Renaissance everything had to be based on the Greek and Roman style. For these guys, no. They are saying, no, that's not us. First of all, we have certain roots, but those are not in Greek or Rome. The Romans were here for some time, but then they left, so that's not us. The Greeks, we had really nothing to do with them. We have something to do, however, with the Anglo-Saxons, who happen to be people who, in the early period, built in, of course, the Anglo-Saxon style, then later in the Romanesque style. But we have even more to do, of course, with the Normans. And the Normans definitely built in the Norman/Romanesque style, and then the Gothic. So our true identity is in Normandy and in Saxony. And that's Christianity, and not the pagan Greeks and Romans. And so if we are refinding our Christian roots, then in architecture, our roots are also in this. Yeah. So, in fact, the book that is the defining book of the Oxford movement was even called, sorry, not the Oxford movement, the Gothic Revival movement was not called Gothic Revival. It was not called Let's Return to Gothic. It was not called Gothic is Cool or anything like that. It was called True Principles of Christian Architecture. So that's the point here. Our architecture must be Christian architecture, and the only real Christian architecture is one that has nothing to do with the Greeks and the Romans, and that's, of course, well, Anglo-Saxon, Romanesque, or Gothic. But of these three, the one that sucks the least is obviously the Gothic. You don't want to get back to the primitive version. You want to go back to the fully blooming version, so you want to do Gothic. Now, he himself, it's interesting, he had a huge effect by writing this book, by writing in magazines and working as a critique, but he himself didn't build that much. But one of the things we can actually remember him for to some extent is, of course, the Palace of Westminster, also known as Parliament. But that, of course, is interesting. That building, as we know, burned down in 1834. If you remember the paintings from last week, when we saw the burning of the Houses of Parliament, that's what we are talking about. And if, of course, the Palace of Westminster or any Parliament building burns down, then the politicians are not happy and they want it to be rebuilt. So that's what happened as well. And obviously they had to rebuild the building in the new, fancy, fashionable style, which was the Gothic Revival. However, it was actually Charles Barry who drew the plans of the building, not Pugin. But Pugin was involved because Barry was big enough name not to draw every single detail himself, just come up with general framework of the plans, the main outlines, and Pugin could finish up the little details. And also he was the one who designed the decorations and the interior. So his status in this project was an important contributor, but not the main genius behind it. And in fact, there are very, very few things that we can mention that are truly only and only his. And like one of them is St. Chad's Cathedral in Birmingham, as you can see. It's visibly a Gothic Revival building. We have the same features. But also, if you remember what I told you when we discussed the Gothic, one almost 100% sure way of distinguishing an actual Gothic church from a Gothic Revival church is if it's built in red brick, it's not going to be true Gothic usually. So this is, of course, Gothic Revival. Now, obviously, this compared to the Houses of Parliament is not very fancy. It's small scale, relatively less decorated. The budget was much smaller. But as I said, Pugin is not especially important as a big name architect, but as a big name architectural theoretician. So his writing is more important than his buildings. I only brought you the photo of the exterior and the low quality photo of the interior because so that you can at least see something that he built. How are we with time at this point? Oh, excellent. 5-minute break. Yes, so what I apologize for is that I actually didn't bring any truly fancy examples of the Gothic Revival besides maybe the Palace of Westminster, which is quite fancy. But if you walk around in London and you see something Gothic looking, there is a much higher chance that it's Gothic Revival than that it's actually Gothic. And some of them are really extremely pompous, like the Royal Albert Hall or the Albert Memorial. Those are truly examples of what happens if the Gothic Revival meets gold and a lot of money. So instead, what we are going to talk about, leaving architecture behind and moving to a movement which is no longer a direct descendant of the Oxford movement. So this is not directly an influence of the Christians. Although, as you are going to see, topics rooted in Christianity are not necessarily something that they shy away from, and in fact they have a lot of such things, but that's in a way for a different reason. So the movement I want to talk about is the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which, if you now hear this and say, this sounds weird, why would people want to name themselves pre-something? It sort of doesn't really make sense. Because usually, pre means before. And under normal circumstances, you do not know what is going to come next because you don't see the future. So why would you name yourself before something? Well, the answer is that these guys don't mean that they are before something that is yet to come, but that they want to return to something which was in the past before something else. Which sounds very modern, don't you think? Let's name yourself something which was not only in the past, but before something else in the past. So funnily enough, they are actually a relatively modern movement, in a way, to some extent even pointing towards modernism, but that's maybe more of a coincidence than an actual plan of theirs. And the Raphaelite, of course, here refers to Raphael, or Raffaello in Italian, the famous painter. So they actually are people who consider Raphael one of the biggest Renaissance painters and one of the biggest painters of all time, a bad influence, because why not? You can consider anybody a bad influence. And this is what they do. They basically are Pre-Raphaelite because what they want is to return to how people painted before Raphael. And that sounds a bit weird. And you're right, I mean, they don't necessarily want to return just to how people painted before Raphael, but how people painted before the Renaissance. So they have a big problem with Renaissance, and especially with specifically the art of Raphael. And now I'm going to contextualize it in some ways. First of all, this is not very different, if you think about, than what the Oxford movement does, the Gothic Revival does, so they do the same. Like, the Oxford movement actually wants to erase Protestantism and return to the ways before Protestantism, so to the medieval Catholic Church. The Gothic Revival wants to erase Renaissance architecture and return to medieval architecture, and these guys want to erase Renaissance painting and return to before the Renaissance. However, while this is absolutely a correct thing if you say this, that this is how it is, yes, these three things are very, very much similar, there is something else here. And that is that basically most people in this movement were painters. Although this is not only a movement of painting and visual art, but also a poetical movement. But most of them were either painters or painters and poets. They don't just fit into the trend of not being satisfied with the Renaissance, but also they have another problem. And their problem is how they themselves used to study painting. And not only they, but everybody in the period. And for a very long time. Basically, if you were a 19th century talented person who wanted to be a painter, the way they taught you is that they gave you a painting by a Renaissance painter and a canvas and paints and told you copy it. And then they said, yeah, okay, but this is different, this is not exactly like Raphael, or most typically Raphael actually, but could have been somebody else. Let's do it again. And once you were able to paint exactly like the original, so you could copy the painting, and the next step would be, and now, and they would do it with not just one painting, but lots of them, the next step would be, and now you get an empty canvas and paint me a painting that if I didn't know you painted it, I would believe that this was painted by Raphael or some other Renaissance master. So basically, their real problem with this whole thing was that they didn't like the fact that instead of asking painters to be original, to be expressive, they actually taught them to paint just like the Renaissance painters and just like the others in the same class, basically. So they didn't like mannerism, mechanistic art, and basically classical poses and elegant compositions. And And they wanted to have a revolution. They were truly revolutionary guys. So they said, away with all this, let's do something different. And they were not as revolutionary as the modernists, who would say, yes, we don't like tradition, so let's get rid of everything, all tradition, and let's just try to invent painting and architecture from the bottom up. Let's blow everything up and try to do something completely different. They didn't go that far. They just said, let's get rid of everything we think is the problem, and let's return to the tradition before that. So that's why they, of course, return to the medieval times, because that's the thing that comes before Raphael. However, we will have a lot of footnotes to that, of course. So, yeah, their principles have genuine ideas to express. Like, if we think about what I just said about the teaching, where they would copy other people's models, and then, of course, that was not encouraging you to have any ideas, much less genuine. To study nature attentively. So, don't learn to paint like others before you, like other paintings, but rather let's look at nature, reality, and let's try to do that. We will soon return to how much what they say and what they do are two different things, but okay. 3, in a way they are sort of saving Raphael here, whom they just kicked him out of the window, and now they are basically bringing him back in small measures, because they say, let's sympathize with everything which is direct and serious and authentic in all previous art, Renaissance included, and reject everything which is conventional, self-parading, and learned by rote. So, by the way, these are their words. So, in a way, everything is okay if it is direct, serious, and authentic. Like, let's not even go into things like hermeneutic circle and theoretical problems with words like this. How do you decide what is serious and what is not serious, and what is authentic and what is not authentic? But hey. And the 4th one, to produce thoroughly good pictures and statues. A very serious point. I don't think too many artists ever said, my program is to paint bad paintings. I'm not saying nobody, but this, the opposite of this would make punks out of them. Anyway, so this is all wonderful, but we will soon see that actually the things are sort of different, and especially because they want to return to the medieval paintings. Now, if you think about it, if you remember when we were discussing Renaissance painting versus medieval paintings, the medieval paintings, they didn't know perspective, linear perspective at all. So there is no perspective in those paintings, but not only that, they are symbolic in color, and they are symbolic in size and arrangement. So, basically, before we start Millet, if you think about this, like, how can you be at the same time extremely symbolical in your color arrangement and paint in a way as if you didn't know how to paint in perspective, and at the same time be realistic and, leave what is... So there's a huge contradiction in this whole movement between realism and medievalism. You cannot really be both at the same time. So anyway, Millet, the painter and illustrator, was the founding member of the Brotherhood. He is actually older than the other members. So now his work is actually in some ways naturalistic. So it does involve, but by this I don't really mean what you would typically understand under naturalism. So don't imagine Émile Zola's writing or anything like that, with slums and suffering and and definitely not like hyper-realism or anything like that. It's just that it actually includes realistic elements which would not be possible in the Renaissance-influenced 19th century style. That's all I mean by this. And he's also known for paintings which are very much full of details, very much dense, and very much, well, yeah, that's just that. So let's see some examples, which will actually show you immediately how much medievalism and realism is compatible. So, the painting is called Christ in the House of His Parents, and it is, in a way, much more realistic than what would have been possible in the Renaissance or most of the 19th century, because after all, Jesus is just a young adult here, and or early teenager or whatever, or maybe not even that, maybe even, but you know, just a boy. And Father Saint Joseph, who we know is a carpenter, looks like a carpenter, nothing special. And the carpenter's office is actually full of wood curls and all of that. So all those things, and there are tools on the wall and half-finished furniture and all that. So in this respect, yes, it is very realistic. So that's fine. I mean, this is, in this respect, they are right. Let's be truly realistic. Let's paint a carpenter's office like a carpenter's office would look like. Yes, but can you imagine a family in a carpenter's office in these crazy poses? Like, why would the mother actually have this position and everybody else? This whole has this like triangular shape, and Jesus is, of course, holding his hand in this. I'm not sure if it's even possible to hold it like that. And then he waves the other one. So the people are arranged like in a medieval painting, not because it makes logic in this setting. It's because, of course, and by the way, who is this guy here? Going there with this little bowl of water. That's actually John the Baptist, who is going to baptize Jesus eventually. So he is there to baptize him. Joseph is not there as Joseph. I mean, he is Joseph in one sense, but he is Jesus' father, standing in for the Heavenly Father as well, not just for himself. Mary is wearing this blue, which signifies virginity, etc., etc. The whole thing is composed as a medieval painting in something that sort of resembles a realistic painting. Now, this is Ophelia. Do you know Ophelia? Hamlet? Does it ring a bell? Hamlet's girlfriend. And this is Hamlet's girlfriend after committing suicide because Hamlet doesn't care about her. So she is drowned, but like this is not how drowned people look like. And this is not because they didn't know how people who drown look like. Even in the Renaissance, well, in fact, when in the Renaissance they started to do autopsies to find out the true working of the human body and the true portions of the human body, and they made lots and lots of drawings about that. They most typically did autopsies on various dead bodies that they found wherever they could find it. So many of them were drowned people. This is not how you look. You don't have, and you definitely don't hold your hands like that with all kinds of flowers, which of course have a lot to do with the fact that she was collecting flowers earlier in the play. So I mean, this is all just purely symbolical and very artificial, if you wish, actually. So let's move to another important member, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Dante, the great medieval Italian poet, whose poems he actually translated to English along with other medieval poets. So, whereas with Millet, very often we have medieval pictorial symbolism, but one painting that I showed you, for example, was Hamlet, a Renaissance play, Shakespeare's play. The other one was a biblical topic. These guys actually, who come after him, are already not just inspired by medieval visual culture, but actually read and translate medieval literature as well. So here, the painting is not only going to be painted like a medieval painting, but will actually have often medieval topics as well. Not always. Christian topics remain, other topics remain, but yeah. And Rossetti, the Italian name, is telling as well. So yes, of course, this is not just faked. He actually had Italian roots. So he mostly translated from Italian and was interested in medieval Italian art. Another founding member. So one of the things he brings in are the Arthurian legends and Dante. In fact, so much so is he obsessed with Dante, not only in his name, is that when his wife dies at an early age, then she actually becomes an image of Beatrice, Dante's beloved dead wife. So Dante's wife, or not really wife, but Dante's beloved woman dies young. The two of them don't actually marry. And then Dante writes his whole life love poems to his dead beloved Beatrice. And in fact, of course, also in the Divine Comedy, while in hell it is Virgil who guides the traveler through the various levels of hell. After that, he leaves behind hell and goes to heaven, and it is Beatrice, his dead wife, who is the guide in heaven. But anyway, back to Dante, Gabriel Rossetti, the other Dante. He actually did marry the girl, but the girl dies relatively fast and early, and then he just feels like, yes, I'm just like the other Dante. The love of my life is also dead, so I'm also going to, merge these two characters. Yeah. And these Beatrice images that he paints, which are partially inspired by Dante Alighieri and partially inspired by his own dead wife, are actually important not just because they are very strong and very central in his own painting, but also because these are exactly the paintings which then inspire those poets who are going to be the founders of the symbolist movement in literature, not in paintings on the continent. So, some paintings, as you can see, usually they look the same because they are all his dead wife or in various guises, as Persephone, as Dante's dead wife, not this Dante's but the other Dante's, or as the Virgin Mary even, in the painting with a Latin title, because we are in the 19th century and these guys just love naming Christian things in Latin. This means, by the way, low the angel of God. So this is, of course, Archangel Gabriel telling the very, very Virgin Mary, because white and blue are both colors of virginity in medieval symbolism, that I know that you're a virgin, but still you're pregnant. Sorry for that. And Virgin Mary's facial reaction is finally appropriate. Up to this point, it was always like, yay! And here it's like, what the hell? Why? Why me? So realism is here, of course, at least in the facial expression, but in other ways it's all very symbolic. And, like you wouldn't necessarily call this painting realistic either, right? It could be, it reminds one more of a B category fantasy painting or something, but like, okay, this is actually a good painting, but just weird. Yeah, this is when you try to mix things extremely symbolic, like the sundial reminding of the passing of time, like this red bird, which might be a phoenix, and if it is a phoenix, then she is going to be reborn. If it is not a phoenix, then it might be the Holy Spirit, it might be a lot of things. But anyway, it's definitely not possible to do anything with this painting if you want to just interpret it as a realistic painting. There's nothing realistic about it, like weird light, one strange figure and another strange figure in telling colors, and one of them is nearing, the other is going away. I mean, this is all truly extremely symbolical. So are all the others. And then the third person I'm going to mention from the Brotherhood, William Holman Hunt, another painting, another founding member, compared to especially Dante Gabriel, he is a bit more naturalistic and maybe in some ways, in many ways, much less symbolical than the others. So we won't have any more these kind of crazy arrangements, and in most cases there will be an exception or two. But this naturalistic is, again, put it in quotation marks, right? You will see. In some ways maybe naturalistic, in others not very much the kind of realism that you would imagine from some of the 19th century realist painters or writers. Yeah. And this was in his early works. However, of course, as he got older and older, he got more and more interested in religious works, and this is exactly how he also got more and more symbolic and less realistic at the same time. Yeah, so let's take a look. This is what the naturalistic painting is supposed to mean. Like, okay, compared to the previous paintings, it is relatively realistic if you think about it. There are actual sheep, which are there just as sheep, and they are not supposed to mean anything Christian. They are just actual sheep grazing there under actual trees, and there is a shepherd and a girl, just because why not? So in this respect, yes, it is much more realistic, and yes, it is naturalistic in the sense as well that obviously he is going to try to grab her breast, and she is not very much letting him do that. So it's naturalistic in this way. But let's remember what I said about Constable's painting in the countryside, that the countryside was never really like that. It was never this careless, ideal, bucolic idyll, really, which is this here too, like what is in the countryside? Work, come on, what work? The shepherd's work is nothing, the sheep take care of themselves. He can actually chase skirts in the meanwhile, no problem in the world. Like, yeah, that wasn't like that at all. So it is naturalistic in the way that it shows some erotic content. I mean, erotic in a 19th century context. Obviously, these days, this would be hardly material for some of those video sharing sites, but that is erotic in the period, but very idealized, very romanticized, very much over-idyllic. But anyway, let's leave this period and let's take a look at what happens to him as he gets older. This is what happens to him as he gets older. We are back to fantasy land, really. And the Lady of Shalott, do you know the story? The Lady of Shalott is closed in a tower, in a very long tower, and she's not supposed to leave. Now, she doesn't have extremely long golden hair that goes down, that's a different lady in a tower. But what she has is that she is not allowed not only to go outside, but even to look outside, but she tricks this by actually using a mirror and seeing the world through a mirror. And so anyway, that's not the whole story. Eventually she leaves and dies and all that. Because the reason she is not supposed to leave is not because she is imprisoned, but there is a curse that if she goes outside, then she would die. And eventually she sees a beautiful young knight and she says, let's risk it. She risks it and she dies. So, no happy ending there. But anyway, this is the part where she is still in the tower, and yeah, okay, we have the mirror and we have stuff, or maybe this is the mirror, who knows. But the paintings on the wall, this is actually, of course, in the Garden of Eden. They are picking the fruit from the tree, and this is just one symbolic thing, of course, here. Not to mention that her hair looks like the tree, and, or Jesus. This is supposed to be Jesus. Jesus in the Bible is referred to as the light of the world. But this Jesus, with all of those trees and the gowns and the whole atmosphere, looks more like Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings. So, that's naturalism for you in the Pre-Raphaelite version. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about another brother who was actually a sister. And in fact, she was a sister in both ways. Like, she was the sister of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and she was the woman member of the Brotherhood, so that's why the Brotherhood is a bit too sexist for the movement, but whatever. She was not a painter at all. She was just a poet, a very, very good and very strong poet. Her poems are extremely suggestive, but unfortunately, maybe not only for the good reasons, because she was sexually abused by his father, went through a nervous breakdown, was suffering from depression. So with this kind of background, of course, the poetry is full of a lot of weight that might not be there at such an early age otherwise. Although she started writing early, it took her a long time to get published. So her most often discussed and most often mentioned book of poems is Goblin Market. Yeah, and other poems. Now, the Goblin Market itself is commenting and criticizing, of course, Victorian gender roles. She had her own experience about that it wasn't okay. Not only, the father, but also being a member of something called the Brotherhood when she was a woman. And not to mention the fact that she started writing early and still she had to become 31 to get finally published, etc. So she had good reasons to criticize Victorian gender roles. It is also, of course, about an allegory about temptation versus salvation, because, of course, we are in this very Christian age, so how could it not be about this as well? But also erotic desire. So it's a work combining eroticism, gender criticism, and Christianity in one, which is a relatively unusual mixture. So that again shows that this is certainly worth reading. Okay, and now let's go to the weirdest of all, and those are the Uranians. And these are also often graduates of Oxford and Cambridge, and they did write in this period, but they were pederasts. Now, this is a moment to stop and discuss the difference between a pedophile and a pederast. The difference is that a pederast is attracted to adolescent boys, not small kids. Adolescent, but under 18. So, and this actually is both a kind of sexual, less, I guess we have to call it a perversion because it's not legal. Although these days it's hard to even call anything a perversion anymore with all of those movements asking for their rights. So I don't know, but they are still not legalized. So anyway, so we can still safely call them perverts. Anyway, so that's one thing. But the other thing is that this, of course, has links back to the ancient Greeks. Because the ancient Greeks did, of course, not only tolerate homosexuality, but the Greek ideal would be that heterosexual sex is just for procreation, and true love is between man and man or woman and woman. That's one thing. That's still not making them pederasts. What does is that they had this ideal in Greece that an older man would actually have a relationship with a young boy of this age who would both be his lover and his tutee. So he would teach the boy about both things of the mind and things of the body. So initiation both to philosophy and to sex. Gay sex, that is. Yes, we might consider them perverts. The Greeks definitely wouldn't have. And so they are finally a movement, not necessarily for the better, but a movement which doesn't want to return to medieval times, but still is in favor of more the ancient pagan ways. Now, obviously, these guys were not necessarily the super famous and super publicly visible group in the period, because we are talking about Victorian morality and a very Christian period. So obviously those guys we've talked about would not like these guys. And that's one thing. The second thing is that their novels and their poems were mostly published in a small amount of copies by small publishing houses. So they were not very visible. But they were published, so it's not like they kept it completely hidden. They did write books of poems and novels about erotic fantasies about young boys, and they did get published in magazines and in books. And also it is very important to mention that while they would have in their writing these things, these are mostly, not always, but many of them were not necessarily practicing what they were writing, more just fantasizing about this. There are exceptions though. Anyway, and why is it called Uranians in the first place? It doesn't have anything to do with the planet Uranus, although with them being gay that would be a great pun if it did have something to do with that, but no, it actually has to do with the English form of the German word Urning, which was turned by the German activist Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. And Uranian is a 19th century term referring to somebody of a third sex, somebody with the female psyche in a male body. But this was actually the 19th century concept of male homosexuality. They said the reason, or one version of the 19th century idea of male homosexuality would be that those men who want other men are really just women trapped in a man's body, so they are not homosexuals or perverts, they are just, somebody trapped in a different body. And obviously, transsexuality was not an option in that period, no gender change operations, etc. So, but anyway, so that would explain just the attraction to men, not necessarily in itself the attraction to adolescent boys that these writers wrote about. Now, okay, so why are we even talking about this weird small movement? Because it wasn't so small, and because they were also sort of important, either because they were somebody's somebody, or because they had a good network of friends and people, or for other reasons. Like Lord Alfred Bruce Douglas was a poet and a lover of Oscar Wilde. So then we have a priest here, which is of course in direct, or clergyman at least, not necessarily priest, which is of course in theory indirectly incompatible with the teaching of the church, but we also have heard about a few scandals in the past times. So anyway, also a poet, a clergyman, and his poem was really outspokenly pederastic, yet was relatively well known, and he was quite famous in the period, unlike many of the others. Yeah. Symonds was also a published poet, and as a literary critique, he was widely published, widely read, and his work on the Renaissance was of central importance in the period. So that's another point worth mentioning, that some of the people who wrote these kind of texts might not have been very well known as writers of those texts, but they might still be well known for their other publications. Yeah. And Baron Corvo's texts are quite widely read even these days, but I mean, he was popular in the period and has been popular since. But this is all fine. These are still relatively minor writers. But then we have a very interesting book and several articles and some more books by Michael Matthew Clayler, who actually has done extensive research and basically was able to prove through both the correspondence and the diaries and even the actual poems and novels and other writings of a lot of big name Victorian figures like Gerard Manley Hopkins, Church of England, then Jesuit, Oxford movement, that he was a member. And it wasn't, I mean, it's not just that he actually was friends with these guys and wrote things in his private diaries. Many of his poems are actually homoerotic and specifically talking about young boys. I mean, Oscar Wilde, I mean, it's not a secret that he was gay, and he actually even was imprisoned for being gay, but not just gay. It's again something that they tried to sort of erase, to some extent, from his biography, saying, yes, homosexual, we cannot really deny that. There are court records about that, but let's just at least keep secret about the, the boys. But no, they are there. And Walter Pater, the great literary and art critic of the period, who also had a lot to do with the various, with not just the ideas of the Oxford movement, but also of the Gothic Revival being spread. So, in fact, while typically represented as a minor sort of semi-public, semi-secret movement, the truth is probably somewhere else. There is hard evidence that the Uranians, these homosexual men attracted to adolescent boys, were probably just as influential in making the Victorian culture and art the way it was as the Christians, who often were even the same guys, which is interesting. By the way, Michael Kaler works in Brno at Masaryk University. So while American, it's possible to just, talk to him here. I might invite him in the future so that he can talk to you about his theories. That's a relatively old theory of his, but anyway. That's all from me for today. And obviously, he will, if he sees this video, he's going to be upset that I'm oversimplifying his ideas. But anyway, see you next time, and thanks for coming.